Hi everyone, welcome to I'm Glad You Are series with Pastor Balan. I'm your host Shifa, and the objective of this interview is to uncover the truths that matter. Today, we are tackling a question that many believers wrestle with but rarely talk about openly. What's the difference between spiritual dryness and God's intentional silence? Both can feel like God is far away, but are they really the same? Is one a sign of spiritual struggle and the other a part of God's divine plan? How can you tell which one you are experiencing? And more importantly, how should you respond? Stay tuned as we explore these questions with Pastor Balan, uncovering biblical insight and practical wisdom to help you navigate seasons when God seems quiet. Firstly, what do we mean when we talk about spiritual dryness?
Spiritual dryness refers to a season in a believer's life when they feel distant from God, disconnected in prayer, or lacking the joy, passion, and intimacy that once they had in their faith. Inability to engage actively in prayer, worship, and Bible reading as they did once earlier. The spiritual fervor or vibrancy is not there anymore. Spiritual life has become routine, lifeless, and it causes fatigue and dryness at times. I feel like, lost the spiritual appetite and no motivation and no desire to follow God and feel at a distance from God.
Secondly, how would you describe God's intentional silence?
God's intentional silence is a period of time when nothing seems to be happening. No prayer is getting answered, not because He is absent, but because He is working in ways we may not see or we may not understand. In spite of our thriving spiritual life, God doesn't seem to be answering any of our prayers. Because of the silence, even we get a feeling that God has abandoned us. Silence has been experienced by believers in Christ Jesus during all the periods. Even in the Bible, we have many examples. We will talk about that in a moment, a little later. He may be, intentionally silent for many reasons. Sometimes God is silent, absolutely silent, to strengthen our faith, or teaching us a lesson, or teaching us or helping us to trust Him even when we cannot feel Him. In these times, He shifts our focus from the answers that we want to Himself. And He prepares us for what is ahead and shapes our characters. His silence reveals if we seek Him for who He is or only for what He gives to us, basically to receive blessings and miracles from God. Are we seeking Him for that? His quietness can also redirect our focus from distraction to His priorities and creating in us a deeper hunger for His presence and for His voice.
Also, can you share some biblical examples that would show us both spiritual dryness and God's intentional silence?
Certainly. Let's take David's life. David's life is an example for spiritual dryness. David, many times in his life, he longed deeply for God's presence. And in seasons of troubles, he felt distant from God. And even he felt downcast in his spirit. Often he was pouring his soul at the feet of God. Yet even in those moments of spiritual dryness, he continually anchored his heart in his faith or hope on the Lord. Often, reminding himself to trust in God even in God's unfailing love. That's what David used to do in his life. Another individual experience of spiritual dryness I can quote from the Bible is the life of Elijah. After his victory over the prophets of Baal, we read that in 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah expected a revival, but instead he faced Queen Jezebel's threat for his life. And he got totally discouraged, and he was so afraid, and he fled into the wilderness. And he was feeling so weary and so troubled, and he felt all alone, and even he was ready to give up. So there in his spiritual dryness, God met him, not in the wind, not in the earthquake, and not in the fire, but he could find God's voice in the stillness. In the still voice of God is what came to him, and Elijah got encouraged. So for God's intentional silence, the immediate example that I could think of is Job, the life of Job. Job, in the midst of intense sufferings and loss and pain, he cried out to God, but he heard only silence. And he felt so abandoned, and he was so desperate, for an explanation from God, but yet God did not immediately respond to Job. And this silence tested and purified his faith. It taught him to hold on even without understanding, no matter what he was going through. But even though he could not understand, he learned how to still trust in God. In the end, God spoke, and he was restoring not only Job's fortunes, but also his perspective and his trust in God's sovereignty. So the best example for God's intentional silence is, this is my favorite, when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick. Instead of rushing immediately, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. We read that in John chapter 11, I guess. So this intentional delay allowed Lazarus to die, of course, so that, when Jesus finally arrived, the miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead displayed God's glory and strengthened the disciples' faith. So it was a powerful example of God's intentional silence and delay. Not because he did not care for us, but because he was preparing a greater purpose in our lives.
I was wondering, in simple terms, what's the key difference between spiritual dryness and God's silence?
The key difference is in where it comes from and why it happens. Where the spiritual dryness comes from, and why it happens. That's what we need to understand. I mean, it's a little challenging to understand the difference between spiritual dryness and God's intentional silence. Let's give it a try. Spiritual dryness is about our inner state. When we feel far from God, often because of emotional strain, trials, or maybe we neglect our spiritual life, it's not always caused by God. Sometimes it's just life or our own choices that we make in this life. God's intentional silence is about his decision and his timings. When he chooses not to speak or act right away, not because he is absent, but because he is building our faith. Or probably he is teaching a lesson for us. Or even at times he is testing our hearts, or preparing us for something greater. So in a nutshell, I could say this: dryness is our condition, silence is God's strategy.
That's very well explained. But how can a believer tell which one they are experiencing?
Say that again. What's the question?
How can a believer tell which one they are experiencing?
Okay. Practical way to tell the difference is to check both your heart posture and your spiritual habits. Basically, what your heart tells you and what are the spiritual habits you are following. If you have been neglecting prayer, worship, and a time of reading the Word, meditating the Word, and if you feel a distance from God, it's likely what you are going through is spiritual dryness caused by a lack of spiritual nourishment. The remedy is to return to consistent fellowship with God and with other believers. If you are walking faithfully with God, on the other hand, staying in prayer and obeying His word, yet His answer seem delayed, or probably you don't hear anything from God, or you don't even feel His presence, you feel His presence is so quiet at times, it may be God's intentional silence is what you are experiencing. A season where He is growing your trust, patience, and dependence on God. So the key is this: dryness comes from drifting away from God. Silence often comes while staying closer to God. So that's the key element which you can use to differentiate or to find out what exactly someone is going through, whether he or she is going through spiritual dryness or an intentional silence of God.
When we find ourselves in such a season, how should we respond? Do we wait, press in, or both?
Yeah, that's a good question. So certainly, we need to understand how do we respond in different seasons. Often people find it difficult to handle themselves when they are going through such seasons in their lives. You asked me, should we really press in or wait? I would say we need to do both, wait and press in, because they work together in God's process. Press in by continuing to pray, worship, and read the word and obey God even when you don't feel like doing so. This keeps your heart soft and your faith active. That's important. You can wait, or you must wait at times. Wait by trusting His timings, resisting the urge to force an answer from God, and believing He is working behind the scenes. Think of it like a seed in the soil. Pressing in is to shoot its roots so deep, and beginning to germinate by breaking open the shell. At the same time, waiting is allowing God to bring the growth in that plant and eventually towards harvest in the right time. Think about childbirth. The baby in the womb of its mother stays there for 9 months, and then at the right time it becomes active and it pushes forward to see the world. If the baby comes ahead of time, its timing, it results in a premature birth. So it's in the same way, waiting for God's timing is very, very important.
Now, can we just summarize everything, what you explained?
Let me try this. In short, it is about trusting God's timing. If you know God's timing, even when He seems silent, you will wait patiently. But if you do not know God's timing, you will get ahead of Him and you will mess it up. You will end up in trouble. The Bible gives us both examples. God promised Abraham a son from his own body. But as we know the story, as time went by and nothing happened, he began to doubt. And he thought maybe God meant Eliezer or maybe Ishmael. Yet God kept on reminding him, pointing him to the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. Still, Abraham did not fully grasp what God is trying to tell or what God's timing is. And when he acted ahead of time, things went wrong. On the other hand, God told Noah to build an ark. And because a flood was coming, God instructed Noah very clearly to build an ark. Noah did not know when the flood would come, and he would have never even seen such a thing before in his life. But he believed God. He just simply believed God. He kept building day after day, obeying the word. Even when the crowd laughed at him and mocked at him, he prepared his household and he warned others, in fact, that flood is coming. You just get prepared. Listen to what I'm saying. Trust God. And because he understood how to wait in God's silence, he and his household got saved. So whether we are going through spiritual dryness or God's intentional silence, believe His word. Obey His word. Keep your faith strong. And most of all, wait for His timing without complaining, without murmuring, and without giving up.
Sometimes the answers we seek are revealed when we pause and trust God's timing. Thank you for being with us today. May God guide your steps, strengthen your faith, and help you trust His timing in every season. And we will see you in next episode. Until then, goodbye and blessings.